She seems to have become much, much tougher. The government reported they'd arrested over almost 8,000 individuals, seized 66 tons of drugs. This is where she's trying to signal that she's taking a different approach.
The Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And when you switch to Fuse, you will now receive Trip Plus membership free of charge.
That's where you can take advantage of things like ad-free listening, early access to Question Time episodes, pre-sale live show tickets, and more. All you got to do is go to getfuse.com/politics, use the referral code politics when signing up.
We will be providing many more offers for members, which I think can be great, including interviews for members only and questions for members only, which I hope you'll enjoy. But the other advantage of signing up, of course, is that you can protect your energy bills by fixing your electricity rates for the next year with Fuse, which is going to be very relevant with the price cap rising by 6.4%. Fuse's new fixed tariffs undercut the April price cap by over £100, with almost £150 of savings for a typical customer on the 18-month tariff. By fixing your electricity rate, you can lock in your price today and protect yourself from any rises over the next year.
So download it now, use the referral code politics after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for the terms and conditions and to learn more.
Welcome to the Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. So where should we start, Rory? About this one, Jonathan Dillahunty. There have been a number of times when you bemoaned the lack of a coherent message from the left in opposition and also the global trend in right-wing populism. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where you think Claudia Sheinbaum and the Marina Party fit into this equation.
Alistair, I think Mexico is an amazing place to start because it echoes two things that we've been talking about a lot in the pod. Firstly, it's a really interesting counterbalance to Turkey because it's actually an economy very similar size to Turkey, GDP per capita very similar size to Turkey. And like Turkey, huge issues around migrants, very large number of Mexican migrants going to the States, large number of Turkish migrants going into Europe, and in both cases, different forms of populism. But the second thing we're going to do later in the show, of course, is compare it to Canada, which has also been the receiving end of Donald Trump. And Mexico's responded in a very different way. But anyway, over to you on your views on Sheinbaum.
She's a very interesting woman. She's a scientist by training and background, so that's similar to Merkel and Thatcher. She was head of government of Mexico City. She's a big environmentalist. She worked on the intergovernmental panel on climate change. It was very much a question of how was she going to get out of the shadow of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, her predecessor as leader of Mexico. She won the general election in a landslide. Since then, she has, a little bit like, as you say, Canada's had its politics defined by Trump. To a certain extent, so has Mexico since she took over. She has handled it very differently. And she is currently enjoying, I checked, the same level of approval rating that Tony Blair was enjoying immediately after his handling of Princess Diana's death when it was up in the 80s. So she's got one of amongst the highest ratings of any leader in the world right now. And the obvious thing to say is, well, that must be because people think she's handled Trump quite well. She has twice managed to stave off tariffs with personal interventions. She praises him privately about his focus on immigration and drugs and so forth. But she's not done anything big and public in terms of attack. But the other thing is that she's actually turned out to be a lot tougher on security than AMLO. And I think this may be in part be driven by that. She's got a very, very tough message on crime and law and order. And then the other thing is that the social programs that she's doing, they do appear to be starting to bear fruit. Now, lots of leaders get very, very high ratings early in their presidency or their premiership and then maybe start to fade. But nobody can say she is not genuinely popular right now.
Let's just look at Mexico for a second. So we did a long section on Turkey in the last pod episode, and we talked about how Turkey set off on its route towards populism. Mexico is not as far along the route as Erdogan, but it's moved a long way. We've got to acknowledge that she was very much a product of Obrador's party, and Obrador put her in this position. And Obrador has taken Mexico a long, long way away from its liberal democratic traditions. I know reasonably well a man called Ernesto Zedillo, who you may remember was the president of Mexico. And in fact, actually, one day we might want to interview him if that was of interest. And he represented a moment where if you go back to the 90s, early 2000s, Mexico looked like it was really on the journey to being the old Washington vision of a particular form of liberal democracy and open free trade, and joining NAFTA and all this kind of stuff. Obrador took over and things began to change. Obrador's a kind of classic populist. He's somebody who has played some extraordinary games with reinventing himself as a Mexican nationalist, speaking for the indigenous community, although he himself is actually, as his name suggests, from Spanish roots. Big, big changes, one of them against the judiciary. Terrible. So he had been challenged by the judges, particularly the Supreme Court. So he and Sheinbaum lent into the idea that the judiciary in future will be elected. That basically puts the executive, his party, in control of the judiciary. And even more worryingly, potentially some of the criminal gangs in Mexico in charge of the judiciary. He's brought the army very much under his control. Obrador gave a lot of businesses to the army, set up a new National Guard under the army. He controls still the party, which Sheinbaum is now the president of. So Sheinbaum very much seen as his creature being used by Obrador. And then I guess the question is, will she break free of him? And if she breaks free of him, is she going to reverse some of these trends towards authoritarian populism or not? How is she going to break free of Obrador? And then I guess the final thing, which makes Mexico very, very different to Turkey, is that although both of them have these huge informal economies, 40-50% of their economies are completely informal, means they're not registered, they're not paying tax, and 10-12% of people working in agriculture. But what makes Mexico very different is that over the last 10-15 years, the Mexican cartels took over control of the cocaine distribution in the United States from the Colombian gangs. So the Mexican drug cartels became enormous. The homicide rate in Mexico is astonishing. There was a small reduction under Obrador, but not a big reduction. And extortion is through the roof. So we've had Mexican companies closing 200 stores because of extortion. We've had senior businessmen being killed.
Looking into the way that she's dealing with crime and drugs in particular, I got the sense that that was the means by which she was trying to escape. He became identified. I don't know whether he actually ever said this, but he became identified, a bit like David Cameron's Hug a Hoodie, with this phrase, hugs not bullets. And she seems to have become much, much tougher. By the end of her first 100 days in office, the government reported they'd arrested over almost 8,000 individuals, seized 66 tons of drugs. So this is where she's trying to signal that she's taking a different approach. And I think the other thing is, just as Trump has transformed politics in Canada, so I think because she has been seen as being under attack and handled that attack quite well, that is probably the other factor that is making it feel like a very different sort of leadership. I think we should say, by the way, Rory, if any of her team are listening, we would love to have her on the podcast. She's clearly a very, very interesting modern leader.
Fascinating thing, as you say, she is Jewish in a Catholic country. She's a woman in quite a macho country. She's quite a sort of intellectual in a strong populist tradition. She's somebody who in many ways sounds technocratic, but she's part of a government that hasn't only taken control of the judiciary, the regulatory agencies, the military, but a bit like Turkey, has basically taken control of the media. 90% of the media now in Mexico is controlled by the government. And maybe we give populism in Mexico a bit more of a pass because it's left-wing populism rather than right-wing.
You might have a point there, Rory. Now, here we are. We had a lot of questions this week, for reasons which will become obvious, about young men, inspired by, and here's the question from Meg, what are your thoughts on the show Adolescents? 4-part series about a family whose lives are ripped apart when a young boy is arrested for allegedly killing a girl in his class. Have you watched all 4 yet, Rory? Have you got to the end?
I've watched the first 3 out of the 4.
Right.
I'd love to know what you thought. I watched it with Shoshana. Firstly, I just think artistically it was unbelievably good. The acting was incredible. Also the courage of the director. I mean, the third episode that I just watched is basically an entire episode where he's taken the confidence just putting you in a featureless room with two people talking to each other.
I think it's fabulous. I mean, I'm glad you said that, actually, because I think that there's a danger sometimes with these things that you go straight to where you think the political debate has gone and overlook the fact that the reason why it's been able to have that impact is because it is a brilliant piece of art and culture. Each episode just follows one camera, just sort of, and the way they do it, it's almost like watching I guess it is a little bit like being in the theatre, but it's even more, technically I think it's even more brilliant than that. And then I think on the themes, and of course this comes at a time where we've just had Gareth Southgate, the former England manager, did the Dimbleby lecture, and it was really good, actually, very much on this theme as well, about the role of young men, how they see themselves, the extra pressures that they're under that maybe we didn't have growing up, or even my kids didn't have growing up. And I think that one of the things that comes through Adolescents is how parents and teachers, we like to think that we know what our kids are up to and the factors that are changing their lives. But do we really know the impact that social media has had on them and is continuing to have on them, and what it's doing to them, to their self-esteem, to their relationships and so forth. So I think it's brilliant television, does pack a punch, does carry a point, but I think it's part of the debate rather than the whole debate, as it were.
But you obviously have a profound interest in state education in Britain. I mean, and what did Fiona think about that? Because, of course, it's a pretty terrifying portrait of non-functioning schools in Britain, right?
Yeah, I mean, a similar impression about the sense of hopelessness of one of the teachers in particular, who seemed very, very nice, but really didn't have much of a clue what was going on. I think Fiona's sense is of schools, not the fictional adolescent schools, as it were, but of the schools that she's involved in, is that they do an amazing job in unbelievably difficult circumstances. Some of these broader social problems now mean that the job of teacher has changed fundamentally. And I was always part of teaching, that was the pastoral, that was the social work and what have you, but that is now much more a fundamental part of their life.
But what I'm hearing from you is that you think that not many schools are that bad, because that portrait of a school, I don't think you really would think that you were giving people a decent education. I mean, there's a lot of lovely posters on the walls, but the classroom management has collapsed so much that kids are not getting basic education. They're not,
but I think the two things to say to that. The first is it is a drama, and the second is this is a school in a drama on the day after one of the children has been murdered. So I think it's not a documentary about the day in the life of an ordinary Northern England school. Because the other thing that came through that slightly went against that was how smart they were. They actually looked pretty smart, and they were smart mentally. There was a vibrancy about those kids, and I think that, I guess what I was left with was the sense of hopelessness, that actually a kid that if you saw the child, and then if you saw the way that he conducted himself vis-a-vis his parents and so forth, you thought that's a nice, balanced child. Whereas it turns out, no, he's actually been kind of radicalized, and this whole sort of incel thing going on. Although, again, back to the drama point, the other person I talked to this morning who said they'd seen it, who'd worked in schools and worked with a lot of child psychologists, and said that, she was too nicely dressed, and she was sort of, showing too much of her own emotion. I think sometimes we've got to be careful with these dramas, that we don't read so much into them that we start to treat them like documentaries. I think we should just appreciate it for a brilliant piece of storytelling.
Partly because it was so brilliant. I mean, I've never seen any police movie take you through the sort of detailed procedures, processes, paperwork of checking a child in, summoning the solicitor, getting the blood samples taken, the sort of... I thought that was all brilliant. So, Alastair, your favourite subject, Canada. Freya, how will the US trade war and Trump's rhetoric shape the Canadian election? Morgana, why is Mark Carney calling an election so soon? And just a little plug before we get the Alastair answer. We've done some really great interviews recently with senior Canadian politicians, including two separate interviews with Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister who's just called the election.
Well, I don't think anybody's surprised that this is what he did. In fact, I think we said a couple of weeks ago that we didn't expect him to hang around long. He had 9 days between winning the leadership election, which made him Prime Minister. He managed to fit in a visit to Paris to see Macron, to the UK to see Keir Starmer and your friend the King, which I think hopefully settled Canadians down a little bit as to where British hearts are in relation to this existential threat, because I think that's how they feel. I was at an event last night and there was a Canadian guy there, and the reason I knew he was Canadian was because he was wearing the maple leaf on his lapel, and I said, "Do you always wear that?" He said, "No, I've just worn it since Trump started threatening Canada." So the question, how will the trade war and Trump's rhetoric shape the Canadian election? It already has. It is one of the prime reasons why the Liberal Party is back in the game, having closed this 20-point plus gap in the polls with the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre. It's one of the reasons, I think, why Mark Carney won the leadership election by such a big margin, because people thought this guy's been around the block when it comes to the economy. He's rolled in the Bank of England, Bank of Canada, in business. He seems like he's a pretty tough guy. And I think then in relation to why he's calling it now, because he's got momentum. It still would be a remarkable comeback for the Liberals to turn this around. I've been looking at a lot of Canadian newspapers in the last few days. I mean, some of them are very, very biased against him. Poilievre has got quite a lot of media support. I watched his announcement to calling the election, framed it very much as looking after the economy, looking after Canadians, Canadian national pride, standing up to America, has made no effort to have a conversation with Trump. Poilievre has, I think, shifted his agenda a bit. But it's in the end, I think America and Trump will be a big part of the campaign. But it's interesting how in the last couple of days already, you've seen a lot of the debate getting on to very conventional domestic election issues, this tax, this education policy, that education policy. So I think it's going to be a curious mix of a very traditional election campaign with this remarkable backdrop of Trump and tariffs.
And Poilievre, presumably, his campaign will try to be as domestic as possible, and will try to focus on Trudeau's record and people being fed up with Trudeau and the Liberal Party.
They're trying to link Carney very much to the Trudeau story. A bit harder to do that than if it had been Chrystia Freeland, because, of course, Chrystia Freeland was Trudeau's deputy and finance minister. So a lot harder. I think Mark Carney can be continuity where it's good and change where it's good. That's how, if I were him, I'd be playing it.
He's also proving, I mean, he did a great social media clip, lovely one, with Mike Myers, and extraordinary. I mean, incredible, millions of views, more than 30,000 likes last time I looked, where he had a pretty terrific comic timing, including a good gag on what are the two seasons in Toronto, and Mike Myers says, winter and construction. Anyway, so I think good luck to him. And unlike Macron, he's calling it at a time when he's in a reasonably good position in the polls and where he doesn't have that long to run anyway. There's not that much time to run. It's not like Macron, who chose to call an election when he was in a very bad position in the polls and potentially had another 2 years to go. Gaza.
We had quite a lot of questions on Gaza this week, probably in part because of the interview that we did with Francesca Albanese, which is the interview that's up now on Leading. Lena, can politicians say whether they believe Israel has broken international law, yes or no? I imagine that's provoked by David Lammy at one point saying they had, and then the next day saying they were at risk of having done so, which looked like he'd been slightly brought into line by number 10. And then Fatima from Birmingham, why does the West talk about human rights but stay silent when Palestinians are killed? We got so many comments on both sides of the argument on the back of doing that interview with Francesca Albanese. And I do think this is part of the problem. So Fatima's question, why does the West talk about human rights, which the West does, but stay silent? Now, there are people in the West who stay silent, but to say the West as a whole stays silent, I think overstates it. And likewise, I got some very, very aggressive emails and texts and messages from people who you would define as either Israeli or very pro-Israel, including some British politicians as well, really quite aggressive. You wouldn't, if you did get Netanyahu, I bet you wouldn't give him as an easy ride as you gave to her and blah, blah, blah. Well, the answer is probably not, because he's a serving prime minister, whereas this is somebody that, for most of our listeners, we were probably introducing her to them. Could we have questioned her more on some of the things that she'd said? Maybe. But I just think what it said to me, what the reaction said to me, is that those people who are broadly pro-Israel listened to the interview determined to say that she was an anti-Semite, and those people who were broadly pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, listened to the interview determined to say that she was a saint. And what we were trying to do, just as we've done with other interviews, for example, when we interviewed your friend Uzi Arad, ex-head of Mossad, the intelligence agency, we had similarly people saying, why were you so nice to him? This is a guy who's done this is a guy who's done that. Well, answer, because we're trying to have a conversation with him about who he is, what he does, what he thinks, and why he thinks it. And I just think people should, particularly people who bang on about freedom of speech the whole time, should maybe understand that sometimes letting people speak in their own terms rather than constantly being pushed around by an agenda is not the best way to get a decent debate.
A very senior individual has been writing that I'm anti-Semitic, and it's it was a really interesting piece in which he moves from talking about 14th century anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, and then smoothly goes from that to saying, and another example of this is Rory Stewart.
How have you responded to that?
Look, firstly, I think I can empathise. I mean, he clearly feels very, very strongly what he's saying. I don't think he's being insincere. I think he feels that I'm anti-Semitic. I think he genuinely cannot understand why someone would think that what Israel was doing in Gaza was unreasonable. But I also think that he doesn't understand that I don't support what we did in Dresden. I don't support what the United States did in many cases after 9/11, that I believe that international law applies to everybody, and that even when you're defending yourself, you have to act within international law and the rules of law. In showing restraint and not doing what Israel's doing in Gaza, you may be taking more risk. It's possible that occasionally some terrorists are getting away or some guilty people are being spared. But that is what international law is about. That's what we learnt in wars, which is that you cannot simply say, I have 100% right to security and the lives of other people don't matter if I'm fulfilling my security. And that's true in domestic law. That's true in international law. And I cannot accept that it's anti-Semitic to say that, or it's anti-Semitic to support the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, or to point out the reality of what's happening in Gaza.
What about this then? This is from Ian Austin, who's a Labour peer. Why did you allow her to use words like genocide or apartheid without any questioning at all? Why was she allowed to say that anyone in the human rights world who criticises Israel is accused of anti-Semitism when people do that all the time, and so on and so forth? So how do you respond to that?
On the latter point, I suppose the question is, are people like Ian Austin comfortably saying they have no problem at all with people criticising Israel for the Israeli government for breaking human rights? Do they have no problem at all with my criticising them on their human rights record? Is he really saying that when you say that, he doesn't come back and suggest it's anti-Semitic? She is an international lawyer. She is talking about genocide. She's talking about apartheid. She's quite careful in what she means by that. And there is no doubt that maybe we can explain what she means by that, but what's at the core of that is something that I'm afraid I observe every time I go to that region, which is that Arab Israelis and Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza, are not treated in the same way as Israeli citizens, and Israeli settlers are favoured in every single way in terms of government services, in terms of security protection, in creating illegal settlements in Palestinian territory when Palestinians are not. And I can, okay, fine, we can get into Ian on what exactly he means or doesn't mean by apartheid, but there is no doubt that they are treated, to put it politely, as second-class citizens. They do not have all the same rights and support from the Israeli government that Israelis have.
Right, last question. Let's go domestic. Lynn Perry is the chief executive of Barnardo's. She says, we support thousands of children across the UK who, 5 years on from the first lockdown, continue to feel the impact of the pandemic. School attendance declining, children's mental health in crisis, over 4 million children growing up in poverty. If this government is serious about wanting children born today to be the healthiest generation of children ever, and about reducing child poverty, there is serious work to be done. If measures like scrapping the 2-child limit on benefits or extending the entitlement to free school meals are too expensive or can't be done for other reasons, what steps can be taken to create a fairer future for children in the UK? 4 million children growing up in poverty.
Yeah, well, let me come to you on that. I don't understand how the government is going to do things for child poverty with its current economic policies. I mean, the ways normally that you do things for child poverty are, as the questioner suggests. You know, we know what the last Labour government would have done. You redistribute. You know, you redistribute through a tax system. You redistribute through more generous welfare payments. I mean, fundamentally, you make people less poor, partly through giving them more financial support. Now, you can talk about other things. You can claim, and I'm sure the government will, that it's going to invest in education, jobs, apprentices. But again, where's the money coming from? And I cannot see a route if what the government is saying is we're going to not raise any taxes, we're not going to borrow anymore, we've got all these fiscal rules and we're going to cut government spending. I don't see how that's going to lead to anything other than growing inequality in Britain and growing child poverty. In fact, I'm pretty confident on the current tracks that if we have this conversation in 2-3 years' time, the situation will be worse under Labour than it was under the Conservatives, unless I'm missing something.
Well, that is, certainly for I'm sure that Barnardo's, which is an organisation that's dealing with some of the most challenged and children with difficult lives. I read their last report, and you know, in Britain in 2025, to see a passage that is about the rise in rickets. And we used to learn about rickets in school when I was growing up as an example of how diseases could be eradicated. When you think that one of the approaches that the government is taking is this thing about, you know, educating children in how to brush their teeth because we've got real problems of tooth decay, or some of the issues we have with child nutrition. You're talking about things that, honestly, in 2025, after the sort of prosperity that we have enjoyed as a country over several decades, it's pretty damning for the country as a whole. And I agree with you. When you think that, you know, these welfare cuts, and you know, the government gave their explanation, and I agree that, you know, the more that people can work, the better. But you and I know, and were you still an MP, you'd be having them come into your surgery. There will be people who are about to lose benefits, who have come to depend on those benefits, and out of genuine need. And at the same time, trying to raise a family and what have you, at a time when, you know, we're worried about the birth rate and we're worried about where the jobs of the future are going to come from. Now, here's a lighter one, Rory, and I want to know whether this means anything to you at all. Luke, how did Tony Blair get to do that sketch with Catherine Tate? Now, do you know what I'm talking about?
No? It means absolutely, literally nothing to me. So explain that, and let's finish off on that jolly note with whoever Catherine Tate might be.
Tony Blair was the Prime Minister. Catherine Tate, a very, very, very famous comedian. And she got Tony Blair to do a sketch with her. This is a Red Nose Day anniversary story. And she got Tony Blair to do a sketch with her where he delivered her most famous catchline, which is, "Am I bothered?" But no, that one was their idea. And Tony was always up for stuff like that. And he delivered it like a pro. "Am I bothered? I'm not bothered. Are you bothered? I'm not bothered."
Lovely.
Yeah. So you now know who Catherine Tate is, Rory.
Thank you with that. And let's finish on that.
See you soon.